Well, you can see Boston when the leaves are off the trees. However you slice it, wealth is very unequally distributed, both within countries and between countries. Oh. Hi, Lola. Come here, baby. Come here. Yeah. Cat interruption. This is a chart of the share of national income held by the top 10%. So in Europe, which is the lowest, 37% of the national income is held by the top 10%. And at the other end of the scale in the Middle East, the 10% hold a whopping, the top 10% hold a whopping 61% of national income. Here is some data for the US. Top 1% versus bottom 50% national income shares, 1980 to 2016. You can see that in 1980, 11% of national income was received by the top 1% in the US, and by 2016 that had risen to 20%, with a corresponding decline in share of national income for the bottom 50%. The European version of this graph, by the way, is basically flat. The Gini index, or Gini coefficient, is often used as a measure of inequality for a given population. So here we've got a graph with two axes. On the x-axis is the wealth percentile. So the bottom 10% are over to the left, and the top 90% are over to the right. And on the y-axis we have share of wealth in percent. So looking at that curve that divides the grey region and the blue region, imagine that's what we get if we plot for a certain population wealth percentile against share of wealth. We can see that roughly the bottom 30% have about 10% of the wealth. If there is no inequality whatsoever, then the bottom X% have X% of the wealth for any old X. In other words, we get that line at 45 degrees. That would be a sign of perfect equality. And as you can see, the curve that's actually plotted is a more typical curve where we have less than perfect equality, and it's called the Lorentz curve. And the Gini index is just the ratio of the A area to the total area, A plus B. So in the case of perfect equality, where A equals 0, the Gini index equals 0. And you can easily see that in the case of perfect inequality, where basically one person has all the wealth, B will be 0, and so the Gini index will be 1. So the closer to 1 we get on the Gini index, the less equality there is. Here's the Gini index represented as a world map. You can see that South Africa has the highest Gini index, 60 to 70 represented as a percent. And the question for this week is all this inequality unjust? From the point of view of justice, is there something wrong with it? Of course, maybe in practice, a country with a high level of inequality is perhaps politically unstable, or maybe people at the very bottom become extremely envious and start causing all sorts of trouble and breaking the law and whatnot. That could very well be an argument for reducing the level of inequality. But suppose that inequality itself doesn't have any of those bad effects. Would there still be something wrong with it? Would it be fundamentally unfair if 1% of the population had 90% of the wealth? The reading for today was, of course, from Rawls' famous book, A Theory of Justice. And Robert Nozick, whom we'll be reading for Wednesday, said in Anarchy, State and Utopia that political philosophers now must either work within Rawls' theory or explain why not, which is an indication of the impact Rawls' book had around the time it was published, and indeed continues to have. Rawls has two principles of justice. These quotes are actually from a later book, Justice as Fairness, but they're pretty close to the formulations in A Theory of Justice. The first principle is that each person has the same indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which scheme is compatible with the same scheme of liberties for all. And the second principle is that social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. So Rawls is not against social and economic inequalities, provided that they meet these two conditions. First, they are to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And second, they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society, which Rawls calls the difference principle. Of course, Rawls's theory is one of many alternatives. Here's one that Rawls discusses at some length: utilitarianism. We've already met that as a theory of morality. Society should be organized to maximize happiness, or the more general version is consequentialism. Society should be organized to maximize the good, whatever you think the good is. And depending on the empirical facts about happiness or the good, this could lead to massive inequality, or alternatively, massive equality. That is, utilitarianism and Rawls's theory are rivals, they are not compatible.